Hello, curious people. It's great to have you with me again for another episode of Curious People Wanted, a video series by the Barnum Museum in Bridgeport, Connecticut. My name is Adrienne St. Pierre, and I'm the curator of the Barnum Museum's collection. And I hope you are already curious seeing the spotted fellow behind me. In a previous episode, I shared a circus performer collection that the museum had literally just received. And since then, we've had several more wonderful donations. So again, today, I'd like to share some new to us material. This is a much smaller collection than the other one, but is equally rich in stories. And really, I'm so excited to tell you about this, and of course, grateful to the donors for entrusting these wonderful items to our care. So you've had a glimpse of my silent partner here. First off, let me say he was not part of this recent gift. He's been with us for several years. But he's here for a couple of good reasons. He will add a little color to the background for now, and later on, he'll help illustrate some big cat facts, all in support of the story I want to share with you about a famous 19th century lion tamer, Herr Jacob Driesbach. Herr Driesbach, as he was known, was a contemporary of P.T. Barnum. And in fact, the two men knew one another pretty well. Driesbach worked with Barnum on several occasions, and they seem to have had, held one another in high regard. Though not as famous as Barnum, Driesbach was definitely a celebrity in his own right, and he and Barnum kept in touch over a period of 25 years or more. Now, the collection we've just received was passed down for several generations within a family related to Driesbach by marriage. The items were first inherited by Driesbach's son, but as the son and his wife did not have children, the collection passed into his wife's family and relatives and down through generations of his descendants. So as you see, we've received several items: photographs, a scrapbook, broadside, a letter, and the beautifully decorated handle of a walking stick. There are two daguerreotypes. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this early form of photography, but if you are not, this method goes back to 1839 and was the first to produce really clear, detailed photographic kinds of images. Each daguerreotype image is unique. It's captured on a silver-coated metal plate, which is obviously quite different from the film and print photography we are familiar with. Since there's no negative involved, just one image is produced and has to be put in a case under glass to keep the surface of that metal plate from getting damaged. Now, both of these daguerreotypes are portraits of Herr Driesbach, one being a conventional gentleman's portrait, probably taken when he was in his 40s, and the other shows him posed with one of his big cats. Now, the traditional portrait bears out the description of Driesbach as a handsome man, someone who appears to have a strong presence and even charisma. The other daguerreotype is quite different. Let's get you a view of this. I hope you can see Herr Driesbach. It's a little tricky with the silvered surface in this beautiful case. The other daguerreotype is quite a different view, and it's probably the earlier of the two, maybe from the late 1840s. And here we see Herr Driesbach as the lion tamer, but not in an active pose, because daguerreotypes don't allow for action shots. It's a bit tricky to hold a daguerreotype so you can see it. So I'm also going to describe the pose. Driesbach is seated on the floor with his legs stretched out to one side, and he's leaning on one arm. Not a stitch of clothing is visible in this photo, though I'm sure he was wearing his costume shorts, but a jaguar is actually in the foreground and is posed in front of his lower torso. And it is quite uncommon to see any animal included in a daguerreotype due to the length of exposure time. So like if there's a dog, for example, it will almost always be somewhat blurred in the image. So this daguerreotype with a jaguar makes it quite exceptional for that reason as well. In any case, Driesbach might have chosen this pose to present his relationship with the jaguar as a peaceful one, not dominating it through fear or cruelty. I've read a few articles about Driesbach in which it is noted that his eyes and his voice were primary tools he used in training and managing wild animals. There was something about his gaze and the quality of his voice that communicated both mastery and trust. And perhaps we'd call him a big cat whisperer today. There are other daguerreotypes of Driesbach similar to this second one I showed you, posed with a jaguar, except that his costume is visible in those other ones. One of them is owned by the Art Institute of Chicago. A couple are in the Ohio State University's Photography and Cinema Library collection. And another is in the collection of the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, Missouri. So in all of those images, Driesbach is wearing a costume that consists of decorated shorts and kind of straps that go over his shoulders and wristbands and gladiator shoes, which is in contrast to ours where we don't see any clothing or footwear. Now, another item that we received in this collection is a repurposed book. This is a sizable volume, a couple inches thick, and it's about the US Census of 1860. And it seems to have been turned into a scrapbook, say around 1873. The majority of things that were pasted onto the pages date from the 1860s and beginning of the 1870s, but there are a few items that are earlier, from the 1840s. And I'm confident that this scrapbook was Driesbach's own creation, his own endeavor, not something that his wife or another family member created about him. In part, I feel sure because there are a few annotations that are clearly his own. And he probably intended to keep adding to this, as there were other loose clippings that were tucked inside some of the pages. But unfortunately, he died unexpectedly in December of 1877 after just 2 days' illness. In total, there about half the pages of the book were used, and mostly we see biographical articles about people in the entertainment world, which of course was the world Driesbach knew well. These are portraits and articles that are part of a multi-year series. Let's see if I can find some for you. These are part of a multi-year series that the New York Clipper newspaper produced. It was a weekly entertainment and sports newspaper that was begun in 1853, and eventually it was absorbed into Variety magazine. Now, Driesbach, must have known a number of the people whose biographies and portraits were in the series. I didn't spot one about him among these, but I did see another about a famous lion tamer of the time named Isaac Van Amberg. And there are also a number of clippings to do with Lincoln's assassination, which are interesting, and about Rutherford B. Hayes, who was a president who lived close to where Driesbach settled in Ohio. The pages that are most interesting in terms of Driesbach's story are at the beginning, and then another page a little further back that is related. But let me first show you this print portrait of Driesbach. It's titled Driesbach and His Pet Tiger. You can see it's a jaguar, not a tiger. In this, he looks to be a mature man, so although there's no date on this, I am guessing it might be from about 1860. It's a beautiful and highly detailed portrait. And just before that, here, there is this long article, a biographical article from the Indiana newspaper called the Kokomo Tribune. It was written after Driesbach retired, so it kind of recounts his life and career. And then I want to show you just inside the cover here. It's very delicate. Here's more of that article I mentioned. Inside the cover here, there is a print of a younger Driesbach with various wild cats, lion, tiger, leopard. And he's written underneath that, Driesbach, as he appeared at the Walnut Street Theater, Philadelphia, PA, on the 4th of July, 2:00 p.m., 1843. So I suspect the print was actually from that time, and that would make it a good couple of decades older than most of the other things in the scrapbook, except for another print that's further back. Okay, on the right here, you see a print showing the Walnut Street Theater in Philadelphia, where Driesbach performed on July 4th, 1843. And this, interestingly, it's the oldest operating theater in America. And so if you want to look it up, the address is 825 Walnut Street. It's close to Washington Square in downtown Philly. And here, Driesbach has written another very interesting caption. He says, "In this theater, I performed with my trained lions, tigers, and leopards, and one puma, or South American panther." He follows with a little bit more description, saying it was a male lion, a female Royal Bengal tiger, 2 leopards, and 1 Brazilian tiger, all 6 in one cage at the time on July 4th, 1843. So this clearly refers to the print you just saw. Now, if you're curious about the term Brazilian tiger, I was too. I was not familiar with it, but I have conferred with Greg Dancho, who's the director of the Beardsley Zoo right here in Bridgeport, and he agreed that this was likely the name for a jaguar. And subsequently, I did find that explanation on a handbill from the 1830s that said Brazilian tiger and then underneath jaguar. So I'll tell you more about jaguars and leopards in a bit. Now, inside the scrapbook, there were a few loose clippings as well as 2 broadsides dating from 1850 and 1851. Unfortunately, not in great condition. They were really crunched up, and I'm sure had been that way for a very long time. I'm showing you one that is the one that's in better condition because at least you can see Herr Driesbach's name, tattered as it is. This is this tall, narrow format, which would actually be longer if it wasn't so crunched up, was a common size for posters in that era. And this advertised, as you can see, a great variety of attractions at Wood's Cincinnati Museum, which is a well-known entertainment venue. But like so many others of that era, it burned. And that happened only about 6 months after this poster was published. We also received the decorated handle of a presentation walking stick. It's bone or ivory and silver and has these beautiful silver fittings and scrimshaw decoration on it, which also documents it for us. So you see the date, January 10th, 1845 on one side, and on the other side it says presented by the keepers. That would be the keepers of the menagerie animals. And then at the top, there is this jeweled silver mount. It's a pale purple stone, perhaps an amethyst, in a silver setting, and it's engraved with Driesbach's name surrounding it. course, the stick portion is obviously gone. The wood seems to have been broken off, but at least this portion was saved, and it's a little gem. The last two items are small framed pieces. One is a letter from P.T. Barnum to Driesbach, and this dates from March of 1872, which marks the beginning of Barnum's second circus season. And that also happens to be the first year in which his circus traveled by railroad. So in this brief note, Barnum invites Driesbach and his family to attend free of charge when the show came to his area in north central Ohio. At that point in time, Driesbach had retired and was living in Wayne County, Ohio, with his 2 children and his wife. Barnum, on the other hand, had just come out of a very brief retirement to engage in what would quickly become a very grand circus enterprise. So I'm sure he wanted to share the success of the greatest show on earth with his longtime friend. To me, this personal invitation indicates Barnum liked and respected Driesbach, and I would say the fact that Driesbach placed Barnum's biography, one of those New York Clipper ones, right at the beginning of his scrapbook, first among the dozens of stories. That tells us that he, too, held Barnum in high regard. Finally, there is a framed photograph of Driesbach's son, Charles. It's probably the 19-teens it was taken. Herr Driesbach married an Ohio native, Sarah Walter, and the couple had 3 children, but Charles was the only one who survived to adulthood. And so he is the one who first inherited this material we now have. So let's backtrack a little bit to learn more about Herr Driesbach's early life. Jacob was his given name, but he essentially dropped it in favor of the German prefix title of respect, Herr. Although Herr Driesbach started as a stage name, in fact, he was known to all by that name even after he retired. And I mentioned that he was close in age to P.T. Barnum. He was just 3 years older than Barnum, born in 1807, and he was born and raised in rural Schoharie County in upstate New York, the grandson of German immigrants. So how did a kid from rural upstate New York end up in this dangerous entertainment career? Apparently, even when Driesbach was a child, people noticed he had an extraordinary interest and passion for animals. And he could calm ferocious dogs, for instance. And there's the story of his rescuing a woman's young son who was nearly killed by an escaped wild cat, I think it was a jaguar, from a traveling menagerie. Traveling menageries used to pass through the area where Driesbach grew up, and so he definitely had some exposure to them from an early age. But his early career wasn't built on that moment of heroism, rescuing the little boy. Young Jacob was apprenticed to become a shoemaker. He was at that for a few years. That was to be his livelihood. But it was not the life he wanted. So when he became a young man, he decided to take charge of his destiny, and he went off to New York City. As the story goes, the incident that led to his career as a lion tamer occurred accidentally when he got a part-time menial job at the Zoological Institute to supplement income from his regular job. And so one day he was instructed to clean out the cage of a Brazilian tiger, which was normally done from the outside, presumably putting a rake or a broom or something between the bars. But Driesbach decided that wasn't good enough, and he went inside the cage to clean it. To the amazement of other workers, he was neither threatened nor attacked. And so it was after that he began to learn about working with wild animals, and these innate gifts really came into play over the next few years. So he began working for a menagerie called Raymond and Company and went with them to Europe, and that was where he received public acclaim. Now, I noticed a number of parallels in Driesbach and Barnum's lives. Both lost their fathers at a young age and were set to work to earn their keep. And both eventually found their way to New York City, where they found their callings. In addition, during the early years of their careers, both men achieved fame in the United Kingdom and on the European continent, and then returned to America. Driesbach was in Europe slightly before Barnum, and just like Barnum, he was introduced to royalty and he received much acclaim. Newspapers described Driesbach as, quote, unrivaled in his mysterious power over the brute creation. And in the menagerie world, he was the person to whom the most ferocious animals were given to train. Barnum and Driesbach's lives intersected, I would say, by 1850 in New York City, and I'm fairly sure they knew each other even before then, because Driesbach was sometimes performing at locations near Barnum's American Museum in the 1840s. Driesbach had contracts working for Barnum at various times. He was doing shows with bears, for instance, at Barnum's Museum in 1850. But mainly, he was building his own traveling menagerie enterprises, he was working with partners, and he was capitalizing on his own hard-earned celebrity. So Driesbach was not someone whom Barnum made famous. Barnum employed him because he was famous. I have no doubt that Barnum admired Driesbach both for his talents as a lion tamer, but also for his bold move in print advertising, having huge color posters made. For example, Driesbach was the first one to have illustrated color posters made to promote his traveling menageries. Now, the Ringling Museum in Sarasota, Florida, has an enormous one of Driesbach's posters. It's very rare. It dates to about 1850. It's over 9 feet tall and 10.5 feet wide. And instead of being designed with individual pictures of animals, like block print pictures of animals, as had been done since the 1830s, this was technically very innovative in being an entire scene printed on a huge scale and in color. It's Adam and Eve fleeing the Garden of Eden and all these ferocious animals in front. So it's a very dramatic scene. I mentioned that Driesbach's method as a lion tamer was notably different from many others, or perhaps all others at the time, including the famous Isaac Van Amberg, who was also a native of upstate New York, but who spent much of his career abroad and was known in England as the Lion King. So the vision of a lion tamer that probably comes to your mind is a man wielding a whip and holding a chair out in front of him or something like that. And perhaps Van Amberg kind of fits that image because descriptions of his methods indicate he could be quite cruel to his animals. Driesbach's method was different. His eyes are noted time and again, his gaze sometimes described as piercing, or in one case, it was described as fierce, although it was acknowledged that his countenance was genial. So the way he took command of wild animals was quite different from Van Amberg and others. And here's how he was described in 1844, relatively early in his career. This was in an ad for the Raymond and Weeks Menagerie, where one would see a great collection of animals, including the greatest animal of all animals, Herr Driesbach, the lion tamer. I think that's a funny description. The ad goes on to say that, of course, everyone will go to see the lions, tigers, leopards, etc. of this wonderful individual who was so distinguished by half the crowned heads of Europe and whose daring feats throw those of Carter, another famous lion tamer, and Van Amberg far in the shade. What were these performances? Well, some of them, especially in the UK, were on stage in theaters, and they took the form of pantomimes, playing out well-known folk tales or Bible stories in which man and beast were foes. Apparently, there were 3 pantomime plays written specifically for Driesbach, although I haven't come across any of these yet. Of course, these pantomimes were intended to be very dramatic and look absolutely terrifying, so the audience would have their hearts in their throat, fearing that the lion tamer's life was in danger. And it's certainly true that the tamer was at risk, because even with the cats being trained to perform, wild animals are unpredictable. And Driesbach did have several close calls. But pantomime performances were certainly not the only kind of lion acts, because these traveling menageries didn't just entertain people in places like cities that were large enough to have theaters. And of course, there wouldn't be that many of them in the early 19th century. In such cases, the large wagon cage would serve as the stage, and Driesbach would perform inside a captive with the animals. So now I'd like to bring on our expert, our spotted feline. This is a leopard, one of the various big cats that Driesbach worked with, though his favorites seem to have been jaguars. It's interesting that he liked jaguars best, even though they would be considered the more dangerous of the two. Leopards are native to Africa, the African continent, and jaguars are native to South America, and they live in tropical rainforests. So, okay, can you tell a leopard by its spots? Well, yes, you can. A leopard's spots are simpler than a jaguar's. You see these spots have dark edges and a solid medium color center, whereas the jaguar has larger spots over the main part of the body, and each of those larger spots contains one or two spots within the middle, so they're called rosettes. So those kind of spots, the rosettes, only occur in the main part of the body, not on the neck and shoulders. So a jaguar's coat tends to look more busy than a leopard's, unless he is an all-black jaguar, and that's a kind of variation. You can just barely see any the spots, but they're actually there. It basically looks black. And then he's called a panther. Same species, though. It's just a variation. And cheetahs, which are also large wildcats and spotted, but they are smaller than leopards and jaguars. They're easy to identify because they just have lots of small spots that are all solid black. Now, another difference between a leopard and a jaguar is the length of the tail. A leopard's tail is ridiculously long, whereas the jaguar's is several inches shorter, but certainly plenty long enough. I mean, this tail would be dragging on the ground if it was down. A leopard's head is also, hello there, more streamlined and a little sleeker, smaller than a jaguar's head, which is bigger, rounder, and has really powerful jaws and teeth that can crush easily any skull. They can crush a skull in one bite. So Driesbach was certainly aware of the extreme threat of working with jaguars, and there was even an instance where he did something quite foolish, or we would understand it as foolish today. He was with his favorite jaguar. The cat was kind of napping, and Driesbach himself was on the ground and he fell asleep. Well, the cat awoke and saw his master napping, and that just, triggered a response. And he saw this human as prey, and so he attacked Driesbach. Driesbach, of course, woke up and was fighting off the jaguar, and he ended up in a kill or be killed situation trying to overcome the jaguar. It said he choked it to death. That's got to be a lot of strength to do that with a jaguar. But the incident, of course, only added to Driesbach's fame as a lion tamer, but I think he was sorry for the loss of his favorite jaguar. As with all the things here in our collection, there are many stories to discover, and I'd like to give a shout out to two people who provided me with many helpful articles about Driesbach and his family. So thank you to Susan Zimmerman of the Wayne County, Ohio Historical Society, which is located near where Driesbach retired and is buried. And also thanks to Nanette Rod, a friend of the Barnum Museum, who has on many occasions graciously augmented my knowledge through her own research. I appreciate your help. And to you, thanks for joining me today, and I look forward to sharing more stories from the Barnum Museum's collection in future episodes of Curious People Wanted. See you then.